Friends, hello. This is me again, your guide through the darkest and most confusing labyrinths of history. Today, we're tackling a topic that still makes a lot of people's blood boil, and not just anywhere, but in Germany itself. There are myths that eat into your consciousness like rust. They're hard to eradicate, even with decades of research and tons of irrefutable facts. The legend of the clean Wehrmacht is, perhaps, the most tenacious and dangerous ghost of World War II. This is a story about how the losers almost managed to rewrite history, and how their children and grandchildren are still dealing with the consequences of that lie. If the truth matters to you, if you want to dig deeper than the school textbook, subscribe to the channel and hit the bell. There's a lot of tough but important content coming up. And now, make yourselves comfortable. We're starting our deep dive. And yes, don't be shy in the comments, your opinion matters, even if it's hotter than the Stalingrad cauldron in August 42. Have you ever wondered why, in the West, for so long, it was believed that the war on the Eastern Front was fought by normal German soldiers, and that all the atrocities were committed by some SS psychos? I often catch myself thinking that history, it's generally an unfair thing. It's written by the victors, we know that. But in the case of our great patriotic war, a paradox occurred. Because the Soviet Union was a closed country, the Iron Curtain played a cruel joke. An information vacuum formed in the West, and it was eagerly filled by those who lost the war, the German generals. Imagine this. Yesterday's Nazis, many of whom personally signed execution orders, suddenly turned into experts. The Americans and British needed knowledge on how to fight the Soviets, the Cold War was already starting, and the Germans needed an indulgence. And they crafted a perfect myth. The Wehrmacht was, in essence, an anti-Nazi organization, a community of honest officers who were simply doing their duty but fell under the control of a mad corporal. And they were supposedly fighting against a terrible, barbaric state that threatened all of Western civilization. And this cunning construction, this seed of lies, fell on fertile ground. In the West, which was itself afraid of the Red Threat, this narrative was enthusiastically embraced. Of course, facts are stubborn things, and they scream otherwise. Back in the 60s, there were honest historians in Germany itself. For example, one of them, who, admittedly later went down a different path, said a phrase that cut through contemporary society like a knife. On June 22, 1941, began the most monstrous war of conquest for enslavement and annihilation that world history has ever known. But who listened to him? Because admitting that meant admitting that your father, husband, brother was not a hero, but a participant in mass murder. And this is where things get really interesting. Let me tell you the story of one man who decided to go against the system. His name was Christian Streit. In 1978, this German historian did what seemed impossible. He calculated. He wrote a fundamental work titled, "They Are Not Our Comrades." And do you know what that book is about? It's about how the valiant Wehrmacht, the apolitical army, organized the extermination of 3.3 million Soviet prisoners of war. Just let that number sink in. 3,300,000 people in uniform who laid down their arms, hoping to stay alive, and were cold-bloodedly killed by starvation, cold, and bullets. Streit proved this with documents. And what do you think happened? He wasn't awarded or patted on the back. In the 70s in Germany, such a wave of harassment arose against him that the scientist had to resign from his own university. He was thrown out for telling the truth. Can you imagine this level of denial? An entire nation, West German society, preferred to expel a scientist rather than face reality. It wasn't until 10 years later that justice prevailed, and he returned as a recognized world authority. But how many Streits like him were silenced at the root? And, you can understand the Germans on a purely human level. It's easy for us to be wise in hindsight, but put yourself in their shoes. After the war, a significant part of the male population had been through the Wehrmacht. How do you tell your wife and children that dad didn't just fight, but participated in punitive operations, shot civilians, or starved prisoners to death? It's easier to say, it was all Hitler. It was the Nazis. And we were soldiers, we just took an oath. The famous line from the movie 17 Moments of Spring, where a movie general says, "The SS did the burning, we just fought." That's not just a script, it's a verbatim quote of that very social contract the Germans made with themselves. And then the Cold War stepped in. It provided an indulgence at the highest political level. The Americans didn't care about the truth. They needed a strong ally against the USSR. And so, former Hitlerite generals, those very honest soldiers, became advisors in NATO, commanded armies, and wrote memoirs that sold in the West in millions of copies. Dwight Eisenhower, the supreme commander of the Allied forces, publicly stated in 1951 that the German soldier fought with honor. Do you understand? The man who defeated Hitler essentially whitewashes the reputation of his yesterday's enemies. Politics, politics, and nothing personal. But society isn't just politicians. In the 60s, a new generation grew up in West Germany. Rebels, hippies, those who asked uncomfortable questions. They looked at their prim and proper fathers and asked, "What did you do in the war, Dad?" And then West Germany was hit by a wave of discussions. But even then, even under pressure from their children, society held its ground. There was an unspoken agreement. Leave us at least something. Leave us our pride. If we lost, if Hitler disgraced the country, then let at least the image of the soldier who froze in the snows of Russia, but was honest and loyal, remain with us. They themselves are victims. They were deceived, thrown into the meat grinder. They fought against the damned communists for Western civilization. It was a psychological anchor that the nation clung to. This line of defense held for decades. And it collapsed, oddly enough, thanks to photographs. Yes, ordinary amateur snapshots.
Imagine, 1995.
In Germany, in Hamburg, a group of historians from the Institute for Social Research decides to organize an exhibition. Not just another dusty archival display, but something that would hit a nerve. They called it War of Annihilation, Crimes of the Wehrmacht 1941 to 1944. And do you know what they did? They collected photographs taken by the German soldiers themselves. There was no ban on cameras at the front, and millions of Fritzes clicked their shutters, capturing their heroic daily life. They photographed everything: eating, resting, standing by cannons, and hanging people, shooting women, smiling in front of burning villages. These weren't propaganda shots, but personal albums that later gathered dust in attics. And these images were put on public display. It was a bombshell. The exhibition traveled through German cities, and everywhere it caused shock, scandal, fights, and hysteria. Imagine, you, a respectable burgher, come in, and there's your father, who taught you to ride a bike, standing with his tunic and a rifle aimed at a crying little girl. The reaction was furious. High-ranking politicians from the CDU, who, by the way, are still in power today, urged their constituents to boycott the exhibition. Why? Because it supposedly defiled and distorted the glorious German military past. The exhibition was attacked by neo-Nazis. Attempts were made to set it on fire. The organizers received death threats. And this wasn't in 1945. It was in 1995, in a civilized, democratic Germany. And then a miracle happened. The exhibition generated such a wave of debate, such polarization, that it became impossible to remain silent any longer. It buried the legend of the clean Wehrmacht forever. From that point on, even in Germany itself, defending this myth in academic circles became bad form. Of course, on a day-to-day level, among the general public, it still exists. Very few are willing to fully realize that their grandfather wasn't just fighting, but was part of a killing machine. And this brings us to the sharpest point, to what is happening right now. You think the Germans, having admitted the mistakes of 80 years ago, are ready to make amends to everyone. But no. This is where political schizophrenia of the purest kind begins. Look at what happens. Germany is willing to call anything genocide. They acknowledged the colonial terror against the Herero and Nama tribes in Namibia in the early 20th century as genocide. The Bundestag passed a resolution declaring the Ukrainian Holodomor a genocide. But when it comes to the most monstrous crimes of the Wehrmacht, the War of Annihilation, Operation Barbarossa, the systematic murder of millions of Soviet prisoners of war, and the siege of Leningrad, that's when German politicians turn a deaf ear. Why? The answer is simple and cynical enough to make your teeth grind. If they recognize the siege of Leningrad as genocide, and it was precisely the systematic destruction of a city through starvation, then they'll have to pay compensation. not just to Leningrad but to all survivors. And not just to Jews, whom Germany pays diligently, but to all siege survivors regardless of nationality. That's hundreds of millions, if not billions, of euros. But there's a second, even more disgusting point. A German historian, in an interview with Der Spiegel in 2023, openly stated what many whisper. We cannot recognize the siege as genocide because it would give the Russian authorities a political advantage. Can you grasp that logic? The truth about 872 days of hell, about eating leather belts, about 1 million frozen and starved children and old people. It's just a bargaining chip in a political game. Contemporary political expediency is more important to them than the memory of the victims. I read that interview, and my hands were itching to write to this historian everything I thought of him. So, the Holocaust is sacred, they pay compensation, build memorials. But 27 million Soviet people, nearly half of them civilians. That's just an unfortunate misunderstanding, a war crime, but not genocide? Hitler, in his General Plan Ost, directly wrote about the need to destroy the Slavs as a race, to clear living space. What is that, if not genocide? Thus, the legend of the clean Wehrmacht, seemingly buried on an academic level, lives on in the political sphere. It's just been repackaged. Previously, they said, the Wehrmacht is not to blame. Now they say, well, yes, the Wehrmacht is guilty, but let's not draw far-reaching legal and financial conclusions, so as not to provoke the Russian leadership. The emphasis has shifted, but the essence remains the same, to evade full responsibility. And you know what's the scariest part of this story? That 80 years after the victory, we, the grandchildren of those who survived and those who died, have to prove the obvious again and again. That there was no such thing as an honest soldier fighting separately from the Nazis. There was a criminal army that enthusiastically embraced the ideas of racial superiority and enthusiastically put them into practice. And those who today refuse to call this genocide are lining up with those who burned the photo exhibition in 1995. That's why I want us to break through this wall of silence. I will definitely do a big analysis of those very German studies that came out after that scandalous exhibition. Their historians, by the way, reached such a point of absurdity that they started using calculators to figure out the percentage of war criminals among Wehrmacht soldiers, arguing, were 50% or 60% directly involved in killings. Pedantically German, boring, but terrifying. We'll talk about that in future posts. But for now, write in the comments, have you ever encountered attempts to whitewash the Nazis? Have you ever heard this myth about the honest Wehrmacht from anyone? Do you think we'll live to see the Bundestag recognize the siege of Leningrad as genocide? It's important for me to know your opinion. Subscribe so you don't miss the continuation. There's a lot of harsh truth ahead that still makes some people's blood boil. Thanks for reading to the end. Memory is all we have.